Hi everyone, Michelle Lyons here from CelebrateMuleyeverty.com. I've been getting a lot of questions about bladder function and dysfunction lately, so I wanted to share my thoughts, particularly today, about bladder overactivity. So, we talk a lot about the importance of anatomy, so just a quick recap. If you have your hand on your tummy and another hand on your lower back, your bladder is just behind your pubic bone. So if you were to reach down and palpate your pubic bone, your bladder would be just sitting right behind it. And of course, we've got the uterus coming down to the vagina, and then in the rear end, we've got the rectum coming down, resting on the sacrum and the tailbone, and of course our pelvic floor muscles running front to back to support them. So before we talk about problems with bladder function, I think we need to just, revise what's normal when it comes to bladder health. So if we think about how does the bladder work? Well, the bladder is a hollow organ and it's got a muscular lining called the detrusor muscle, and that's what squeezes to empty the bladder. So emptying your bladder should always just be a passive letting go. You should never strain to urinate. Some of the most important relationships in the pelvis are the relationships between the different organs. The bladder and the bowel love to talk to each other, so if one of those is unhappy, the other one probably will be as well. But when we're talking about bladder dysfunction, this is a really important relationship, the brain and the bladder, and how are they talking to each other, and is it a healthy relationship that they have with each other? So we think about how our bladder works then, how does it interact with the brain and with the nervous system? And we have, if we're going to take a deep dive into bladder neurophysiology, we can break it down into a couple of simple steps. There are 4 feedback loops in our body called Bradley's loops, and these are really important for making sure that the brain and the bladder, the brain and the nervous system really are communicating properly with the bladder and the pelvic floor muscles. So Bradley's loop number 1 is where you have the awareness to void. So you start thinking, I feel like it's almost time for me to go empty. Now, when should that be? What can our bladder actually hold? Well, your bladder, the average adult human bladder, has a capacity of about 400 mils. So that is just shy of 16 fluid ounces. So about 400 mils, when it's full. When we empty the bladder, you're usually left with a little bit behind. So about 50 mils would be a normal post-void residual, so not a whole lot. So when our bladder is empty, it's about this size. When it's full, it's about this size. So it goes from being a pelvic organ to an abdominal organ. And we need a couple of different strategies for keeping control over our continence. So we need to have an intact support system underneath. So our connective tissue, our fascia, the ligaments, as well as the pelvic floor muscles, to give us that ability to support the bladder, but also to be able to close the sphincters when we need to as well. So the first Bradley's loop then is awareness. We get the message from the bladder to the brain. We want to start thinking about making our way to the bathroom. Bradley's loop number 2 then is when the muscles in the bladder lining contract long enough and strong enough to empty almost completely. Remember, your bladder never empties 100%. There's always that little post-void residual left inside. So Bradley's loop number 1, awareness. Bradley's loop number 2 is the detrusor muscle contracting long enough and strong enough to empty out. Bradley's loop number 3, which I think is the best loop, is about the relationship between the pelvic floor muscles and the detrusor contraction. So essentially what that means is the pelvic floor muscles that support the bladder and control the opening and closing of it, when they're contracting, the bladder should relax and stretch and go into storage mode. When you sit down to urinate, your pelvic floor muscles should relax, and that's a signal for the detrusor to contract and empty the bladder. So again, when you're urinating, it should just be a passive letting go. The muscles should be relaxed. The bladder can contract long enough and strong enough to almost completely empty. So this is a reason why it's a really bad idea to practice doing your pelvic floor exercises midstream while you're sitting on the toilet, because when the detrusor muscle in the lining of the bladder senses that the muscles are contracting, it stops emptying. And you can hold on to too much urine in the bladder, and that can lead to irritation of the bladder lining or even potentially a urinary tract infection. So that's really important when we think about overactive bladder, when the bladder is telling you that you need to go and urinate again, even though it's only been about 20 minutes since your last trip. what's normal for the length of time between trips is about 2 hours. So Alfred Hitchcock said that the length of a movie should be tailored to the endurance of a human bladder. So when I'm teaching, I usually quip that a really functional test then for bladder function and tolerance is go watch Titanic, because it's about 3 hours long and there's a lot of water sloshing around. So Bradley's loop number 4 is all about keeping the sphincters closed then during filling. So if the sphincters are closed, if the pelvic floor muscles are on, that allows the detrusor to relax and the bladder to fill up until we get to that 400 mils mark. So what causes problems then, particularly if we're talking about overactive bladder where you're having to go every 20 minutes, every half an hour, every 40 minutes, when you should be able to wait about 2 hours in between trips to the bathroom? Some of it can be habit. We get into the habit of going to the bathroom just in case before we go out. Some of it can be the habit of you're driving home, but you get home and you put the key in the door and then you get this overwhelming urge to urinate. And sometimes it's just the urge, and sometimes you do actually leak a little bit with it as well. Some of it could be due to bladder irritants. Now, there are certain irritants out there that do have an effect on the bladder, like coffee, some carbonated beverages. Some people find citrus or tomatoes or spicy food. So it's worth looking at each of those and maybe taking it away for a week or 10 days and seeing how you get on. It's a really good idea if you are struggling with urgency or frequency issues around bladder control to use a bladder diary. Now, you can either use a paper diary, you can just write it down in a notebook, or you can get an app for your phone like IP, which is I think about 99 cents, so not very expensive. And that can be a really good way to look at your input and your output and just see what sort of habits you have. If you notice, if you have 3 cups of coffee in the morning, are you having to go every half an hour in the afternoon? So I've come up with what I call the 5C strategy for managing bladder overactivity. So C number 1 is constipation. If you're constipated, you're much more likely to have an overactive bladder or just an irritated bladder. So it's really important that you're aspiring for a happy, healthy gut. Ideally a bowel movement, a nice type 4 bowel movement every day or at least every other day. And if you head over to the website celebratemuliebrity.com and you go to the free resources, you'll see I have a little free resource there you can download called Constipation Cures. Strategy number 2, the second C, is clock watching, and this is using a bladder diary. So if you're going every 20 minutes, it's not reasonable to expect that you can go from going every 20 minutes to the bathroom to going every 2 hours just like that. So what you need to do is you need to start gently stretching out these intervoid intervals, so the time between trips to the bathroom. So that might look like just 5 minutes extra. So you're starting to get the urge to go to the bathroom again. It's only been 20 minutes. You're going to need some strategy for just, could you wait an extra 5 minutes between trips? So 5 minutes is not a huge amount of time, but if you're having a lot of urgency, you're going to need some strategies, and that's where the third C comes in. And the third C is concentration. So remember I was saying the brain and the bladder love to talk to each other. Now, if the bladder is contracting and saying we need to go, we need to go, we need to empty, and the brain is like, oh, okay, maybe we should panic. What happens? What'll happen if we leak? And everything starts getting ramped up in terms of stress. What we need to do is we need to distract the brain by telling it to look over there. So you can do that in a couple of different ways. We can maybe just do some calming, slow, deep breaths. We can do some distraction techniques like counting down from 100 in sevens, because everybody can go 193 and then you actually have to start thinking. So we've got 3 C's so far: constipation, clock watching, using the bladder diary to start stretching it out, concentration, using different strategies to distract your brain. And we can also use contractions of the pelvic floor. That's your 4th C. So remember we talked about Bradley's loops, those physiological feedback mechanisms between the brain and the nervous system and the bladder. Remember I said Bradley's loop, number 3, is the best Bradley's loop. That means if you're contracting your pelvic floor, it tells the bladder to relax. So just doing some quick flicks of the pelvic floor can actually calm down the bladder, telling you we've got to go, we've got to go, we've got to go, we've got to go. So you can put all those together and you can try a number of different strategies. So when you get that urge to go, even though it's only been a half an hour since your last trip, check and see. Try 5 slow, deep breaths. Try some physical distractions, like maybe doing some heel raises, so going up and down on your toes. Do some quick flick contractions of the pelvic floor. Do some mental distractions, like counting down from 100 in sevens. That should calm the urge down enough that you can regain control and just stretch out that interval a little bit. So you want to aim for maybe just extending it 5 minutes the first week. So if you've been going every 20 minutes, maybe your goal for the end of week 1 is to be going every 25 minutes, and then every 30 minutes, and then every 35 and 40 minutes, and just a really gradual, non-threatening way to keep the brain happy, to keep the bladder happy, and to work towards that goal of having 2 hours between your trips to the bathroom. Of course, making sure you're not getting constipated in the meantime. The 5th C is circumference. We know that if you're carrying a lot of excess weight, particularly weight around the center of your body, that can put a lot of pressure both downwards on the bladder, but also it can really influence your ability to be able to close off the opening to the bladder as well. So really looking at what's driving weight gain around the center of the body. Now, there are a couple of obvious strategies that you can address to help deal with that, you know, making sure that you're avoiding food with added sugar. But 2 surprising strategies that are linked to weight gain around the center of the body are stress, because cortisol influences our body putting on fat around the center of the body. It's a stress hormone. So maybe looking at your stress management technique, maybe taking those slow, deep, calming breaths in terms of deferring the urge to urinate would be helpful, but can also help you when you start to get stressed out. And the other maybe surprising strategy for managing weight around the center of the body, that bit of belly fat, is making sure that you're getting a good night's sleep, good quality sleep as well. Poor quality sleep is linked not only to increased weight around the center of the body, but it's also linked to chronic pain. So it's really important that you take good sleep hygiene management steps, making sure your room is cool and dark, no screens in the bedroom, you know, really just setting up a little nighttime ritual, because your bowel loves a bit of habit. It loves to go in the same bathroom at the same time in the same house every day. You'll notice sometimes when you travel, your bowel can get a little bit sluggish, as we say. But your brain, when it comes to sleep, also likes a little bit of ritual. Sometimes what can be really helpful is using an essential oil like lavender. It's very soothing for the nervous system, and we know that the olfactory, your sense of smell, is very much tied to your emotional center as well. So sometimes, you know, especially maybe when you're traveling and sleep and bowels can be a little bit disrupted, smelling lavender will remind your brain, okay, it's wind down time now, we're going to get ready to go to bed. So those are the 5 C strategies that I recommend for managing bladder overactivity. You can read the full text of this with a little bit of extra information as well if you head on over to the blog at celebratemulieaberty.com, and there'll be some links to some helpful resources there. And you'll be able to read an excerpt from the upcoming book, the Happy Healthy Bladder Workbook, which will hopefully be out early 2019. Just useful strategies to help you be in charge of your bladder again. If you've got any questions, you can find me on Facebook, Michelle Lyons, Celebrate Mulieaberty, or on Instagram, Michelle Lyons_Mulieaberty. And don't forget, if you sign up for one of the free resources, you'll get these blogs sent directly to your email inbox. That's all for now. We'll be continuing with an ongoing theme of women's health, featuring bladder and bowel and brains and bones as we move forward over the next few months. And I look forward to hearing your feedback and continuing these conversations. Bye for now. Thank you.